Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be diving into some pretty radical economic ideas.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
talking about potentially scrapping income tax as we know it. You might have heard some buzz about this from Trump,
Right.
who's been floating this idea of replacing the IRS with something called the External Revenue Service,
Okay.
or ERS for short.
Interesting.
Our source material for this deep dive is a YouTube video from Mark Moss
Yeah.
titled Trump Introduces ERS, Ending Income Tax as We Know It.
Wow.
So buckle up because we're going to explore what this could mean for the economy and for you.
It's a pretty bold concept, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Essentially, the idea is to shift away from taxing individual income and rely primarily on tariffs.
Tariffs.
Yeah, those taxes on goods imported from other countries.
Okay, so instead of getting taxed on our paychecks, we'd be paying more for things we buy from overseas.
Right.
But how would that actually work? Could tariffs really bring in enough money to fund the entire government?
That's one of the big questions. And to understand the potential implications, it's helpful to look at some historical context.
Right.
You see, before the IRS was established in 1913, the U.S. government actually relied heavily on tariffs for revenue.
Really?
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
So this ERS thing isn't entirely unprecedented.
Exactly.
Right.
Interesting. In the video, Moss even plays a clip of Trump on the Joe Rogan podcast, where Trump talks about a commission formed back in 1887 to figure out what to do with the surplus generated by tariffs.
Wow.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
Having so much money from tariffs that you don't know what to do with it.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But is that kind of scenario realistic in today's world?
Yeah.
I mean, our economy is vastly different than it was back then.
It's definitely a different landscape.
Right.
And to assess the feasibility of ERS, we need to look at some modern examples.
Okay.
There are actually countries today that function without any income tax at all.
Wait, seriously? No income tax whatsoever?
None.
Tell me more.
Well, Moss mentions a few in the video, the UAE. Okay.
Bahamas, Cayman Islands,
Wow.
Monaco, and Qatar.
Okay.
He specifically highlights his experience in Dubai, describing it as having fantastic infrastructure and a booming economy,
Right.
all without burdening residents with income tax.
Okay, that sounds pretty tempting.
Right.
But I'm guessing there's a catch. Right.
Yeah.
How does Dubai manage to fund its government without income tax?
It's not a complete tax haven.
Okay.
They have a 5% VAT,
Okay.
which is similar to a sales tax, and a 9% corporate tax.
Okay.
But Moss argues that Dubai makes up for the lack of income tax by attracting businesses with its low-tax, pro-business environment.
So instead of taxing individuals directly, they generate revenue through other means and by fostering economic growth.
Right.
That's pretty interesting. But could a similar model work in the U.S.?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
And to answer it, we need to consider a few key factors, including the sheer size and complexity of the U.S. economy.
Right. We're not exactly a small island nation like the Bahamas.
Precisely.
Yeah. And that brings us to an important concept called Hauser's Law.
Hauser's Law.
Yeah, it essentially states that government spending is limited by the amount it takes from the economy.
So no matter how much the government tries to raise taxes,
Right.
it's always going to be limited by the overall size of the economic pie.
That's the general idea.
Okay.
Hauser's Law suggests that the percentage of GDP going to government revenue remains relatively constant regardless of tax rates. So even if we shifted to ERS and eliminated income tax,
Okay.
the government's overall take might not change drastically.
That's something to think about.
Right.
But if the government's share of the pie stays roughly the same, wouldn't that mean we're just shifting the burden from one group of people to another?
That's a valid concern.
Okay.
And it's one of the main arguments against relying too heavily on tariffs.
Okay, so let's dig into that a bit more.
Okay.
What are the potential drawbacks of ERS? What are the trade-offs we need to consider?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is the potential for inflation.
Infl-
Yeah. Tariffs make imported goods more expensive, which could lead to higher prices for consumers across the board.
Makes sense.
Think about everything we buy from overseas.
Yeah.
Clothes, electronics, food.
Right.
Those prices could all go up.
Ouch. That doesn't sound good.
Right.
And I bet it would hit lower-income households the hardest,
Right. Exactly.
since they spend a larger portion of their income on essential goods.
Exactly. That's what makes tariffs a potentially regressive form of taxation.
Okay.
It means that people with lower incomes end up paying a larger percentage of their income in taxes, even if the dollar amount is the same for everyone.
That definitely raises some concerns about fairness and equity.
Right.
Are there any other potential downsides we should be aware of?
Another risk is the possibility of retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
Okay.
If we slap tariffs on their goods, they might do the same to ours, which could hurt American businesses that export products.
Right.
It could potentially trigger a trade war, which would be bad news for everyone.
Yeah, that's no good.
Not good.
Okay, so there are definitely some serious risks to consider.
Yeah.
But let's be honest. Trump
Yeah.
has a history of shaking things up when it comes to taxes.
He does.
Remember the tax cuts he implemented during his first term?
You're right. He enacted some significant changes like
Yeah.
accelerated depreciation and bonus depreciation, which allowed businesses to write off the cost of their investments more quickly.
Right.
And he's already promised more tax changes for his second term,
Oh, wow.
like no taxes on tips,
Okay.
overtime pay,
Interesting.
or even Social Security benefits.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
It is.
But it sounds like some level of tax reform is pretty much a given,
Yeah.
even if this whole ERS thing doesn't completely replace income tax.
That seems to be the consensus among experts.
Okay.
The question is how far those reforms will go and what the ultimate impact will be on the economy and on individual taxpayers.
All right, so let's get down to brass tacks.
Okay.
Could tariffs actually generate enough revenue to replace income tax entirely?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
In the video, Moss breaks down some numbers to illustrate the challenge.
Okay.
In 2024, total U.S. imports were around $3.8 trillion.
All right.
Total federal revenue for that same year was about $5 trillion.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So how much revenue could we realistically generate from tariffs?
Well, even with a 20% tariff on all imports,
Okay.
like Trump has proposed,
Mhm.
we'd only be talking about roughly $766 billion,
Which is,
only about 15.6% of total federal revenue.
wow.
So you can see even a pretty hefty tariff wouldn't come close to covering the gap left by eliminating income tax.
So realistically, how likely is it that this ERS plan actually becomes a reality?
Well, there are some serious hurdles to overcome.
Okay.
Moss points out potential opposition in Congress,
Yeah.
resistance from what he calls the IRS deep state,
Uh-huh.
and lobbying from tax professionals who understandably benefit from the current system's complexity.
Yeah, I could see how those folks wouldn't be too thrilled about this.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not just about gut feelings. Moss also mentions some betting market data, which can give us a more objective look at the odds.
Gotcha.
The betting markets give a 33% chance of ending taxes on tips, 60% chance of cutting corporate taxes,
Okay.
and only a 21% chance of cutting taxes for high earners.
So it sounds like corporate tax cuts are the most likely,
Mm-hmm.
but overall, the future of ERS is still pretty uncertain.
Exactly. While full implementation of ERS seems like a long shot,
Okay.
some level of tax reform appears to be on the horizon.
Okay, so what does this all mean for our listeners?
Right.
What should they be prepared for?
Well, two key takeaways stand out.
Okay.
First, regardless of whether tariffs fully replace income tax, we can probably expect higher prices on imported goods due to those tariffs.
So get ready for some sticker shock at the store. That's
Exactly.
the second takeaway.
The second is that some level of tax cuts seems likely, but the extent of those cuts remains uncertain.
Got it. So there are definitely changes brewing, but exactly how those changes will play out is still a bit of a mystery.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
But here's something empowering to keep in mind no matter what happens.
Okay.
There are always strategies to legally minimize your tax burden.
Absolutely. Knowing the tax code and taking advantage of available deductions and credits can make a significant difference in how much you owe.
Right.
And if you're looking for more tips on that, we have a whole other deep dive on tax strategies that we'll link in the show notes.
Great idea.
So we've covered a lot of ground here today.
We have.
We've talked about Trump's proposed ERS,
Mm-hmm.
the potential pros and cons,
Right.
its historical context,
Right.
and even what it could mean for your wallet.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Uh-huh.
I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking question to ponder.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
If the government could potentially fund itself without directly taxing your income, what does that say about the current system? And what possibilities might open up if we reimagine how taxes work?
That's a really interesting question to consider. It certainly challenges some fundamental assumptions about how we fund public services.
Totally. It's like, if we can get this money from tariffs,
Yeah.
why have we been relying so heavily on individual income tax for so long?
Right.
We'll delve deeper into these questions and explore potential alternatives in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
It's a question worth exploring. The historical reasons for our reliance on income tax are complex, but it's partly tied to the rise of the modern welfare state and the need to fund social programs.
So as the government's role expanded, it needed new ways to generate revenue, and income tax became a key part of that equation.
Exactly. But now with Trump throwing this ERS idea into the mix, it's forcing us to re-examine those assumptions and consider whether there might be alternative approaches.
It's like we're suddenly questioning the foundation of the entire system.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And that can be both exciting and a little unnerving.
Totally. But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
Before we start dismantling the entire tax code, we need to carefully consider the potential consequences of shifting to a tariff-based system.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest concerns, as we touched on earlier, is the issue of regressivity. If lower-income households end up bearing a disproportionate burden of the tax burden, that's a serious problem.
Right. We don't want to create a system that exacerbates income inequality. So how could we address that potential issue?
Well, one solution could be to implement targeted tax credits or rebates for lower-income households to offset the impact of higher prices on essential goods.
So basically giving some of that tariff revenue back to those who need it most.
Precisely. It's about finding ways to mitigate the regressive effects and ensure a fair distribution of the tax burden.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But even if we could address the fairness issue, there's still the question of whether tariffs alone could generate enough revenue to fund all of the government's responsibilities.
That's the crux of the matter. And it's where things get even more complex, because ERS is only one piece of the puzzle.
Right. It's not just about finding a new revenue stream. It's about rethinking the whole system of government spending.
Exactly. If we're going to fundamentally change how we collect taxes, we also need to have a serious conversation about what we prioritize as a society and how we allocate those resources.
It's like a giant budget spreadsheet, but for the entire country.
Essentially, yes. And it's a spreadsheet that's riddled with competing interests, political agendas, and ideological differences.
Talk about a headache.
Yeah.
But seriously, this raises some fascinating questions. Like, if we weren't so focused on taxing individual income, could we potentially reduce the overall size and scope of government? Could we shift towards a more localized system where decisions about spending are made closer to the people they affect?
Those are excellent questions, and they get to the heart of the debate about the role of government in society. Do we want a large centralized government that provides a wide range of services, or a smaller, more limited government that focuses on core functions?
And how do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? It's a tangled web.
It certainly is, but these are the kind of conversations we need to be having as we navigate the complexities of a rapidly changing world.
And it all comes back to that empowering thought we mentioned earlier. No matter how overwhelming these issues may seem, remember that you have a voice. Get informed, get involved, and be part of shaping the future you want to see.
Well said.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential impact of ERS on government revenue and spending. But what about the broader economic implications? Could this really shake things up, as Trump suggests?
Well, it's certainly a disruptive idea, and anytime you introduce major changes to the tax system, you're going to see ripple effects throughout the economy.
For example?
One potential outcome is a shift in consumer behavior. If tariffs make imported goods more expensive, people might start buying more domestically produced goods.
So it could boost American manufacturing.
It's possible. But it could also lead to higher prices for consumers if domestic producers aren't able to meet the increased demand.
So there's a potential trade-off there.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of carefully considering both the intended and unintended consequences of any major policy change.
It also underscores the complexity of the global economy. I mean, we're so interconnected these days that it's hard to predict how one change will impact other countries and industries.
Absolutely. And that's why economists often disagree about the long-term effects of policies like tariffs. There are just so many variables at play.
So we need to be cautious about making grand pronouncements or assuming we have all the answers.
I agree. Humility is key when it comes to economic forecasting.
But even with all the uncertainty, I have to admit there's something intriguing about this whole ERS idea. It's like a challenge to think outside the box and explore new possibilities.
I understand that sentiment. It's a provocation, a thought experiment that forces us to confront our assumptions and consider alternative ways of doing things.
And who knows, maybe those alternative ways could lead to a better system, one that's more equitable, more efficient, and more sustainable.
It's certainly a worthy goal, and the fact that we're having these conversations is a positive sign. It shows that we're not simply accepting the status quo, but actively searching for ways to improve it.
That's the spirit. And even if ERS itself never becomes a reality, the debate it has sparked could lead to valuable insights and innovations.
Absolutely. It's like shaking up the snow globe and seeing where all the flakes land.
I like that analogy. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think the key takeaway is that we need to be open to exploring new ideas, even if they seem radical or unconventional.
I completely agree. The future is not preordained. It's something we create through our choices and our actions.
And that includes our willingness to challenge the status quo and imagine new possibilities.
Well said.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential economic implications of ERS and the need to approach such a major shift with a healthy dose of caution and critical thinking. But there's one more elephant in the room that we need to address.
Oh boy, here we go.
What are the chances that Trump is actually serious about all this?
Yeah.
Is ERS a genuine policy proposal or just another attention-grabbing headline?
Well, as with most things, Trump, it's hard to say for certain.
True, true. The man keeps us on our toes. But I'm curious, what are your gut feelings on this?
Okay, let me preface this by saying that I'm not a fortune teller, nor do I have any special insight into Trump's mind. But based on his past behavior, his penchant for dramatic pronouncements, and the political realities of getting such a radical proposal through Congress, I'd say the likelihood of full-fledged ERS replacing income tax is slim.
Slim, huh? So you're thinking more of a publicity stunt than a concrete plan.
I wouldn't go that far. I think it's more likely a negotiating tactic, a way to push the Overton window and shift the conversation in a direction that favors his broader economic agenda.
Overton window. You've lost me again.
The Overton window is a concept in political theory that describes the range of policies considered politically acceptable at a given time. Trump is a master at pushing the boundaries of that window, introducing ideas that were previously unthinkable and making them part of the mainstream discourse.
So he's basically saying, look, if we can at least talk about scrapping income tax entirely, then maybe cutting taxes on tips or lowering corporate rates doesn't seem so crazy anymore.
Exactly. It's a way of framing the debate and making seemingly radical proposals appear more moderate by comparison.
Clever, if a bit manipulative.
That's one way to put it.
So even if ERS itself never sees the light of day, it could still pave the way for other, less dramatic but still significant tax changes.
That's the key takeaway. It's unlikely that income tax will disappear overnight, but the conversation sparked by ERS could have a lasting impact on how we think about and approach taxation in the years to come.
And that, my friends, is why we deep dive. Because it's not just about the headlines, it's about understanding the nuances, the context, and the potential ripple effects of even the most out there ideas.
Well said.
All right, I think we've thoroughly dissected this ERS beast.
I believe we have.
But there's still one burning question in my mind.
What's up?
If we were to ditch income tax, where would we get the money to fund, basic government functions? National defense, infrastructure, education, all that important stuff.
That's the crux of the matter, isn't it? And it's where things get even more complex, because ERS is only one piece of the puzzle.
Right. It's not just about finding a new revenue stream. It's about rethinking the whole system of government spending.
Exactly. If we're going to fundamentally change how we collect taxes, we also need to have a serious conversation about what we prioritize as a society and how we allocate those resources.
So it's about looking at the big picture, the entire budget, and figuring out where we can make cuts, where we need to invest more, and how we can create a system that's both fiscally responsible and meets the needs of our citizens.
Precisely. It's a complex balancing act, but one that's essential for a healthy and functioning society.
And it all circles back to what we were discussing earlier about individual empowerment. We need to be informed, engaged citizens who participate in these conversations and advocate for the policies we believe in.
Couldn't agree more. Our democracy depends on it.
All right, deep divers, we've given you a lot to chew on today. But don't worry, you don't have to digest it all at once. Take your time, explore the resources we'll link in the show notes, and most importantly, keep those brains buzzing.
Until next time.
This has been a fascinating exploration of ERS and its potential implications. We've covered a lot of ground, from the history of tariffs to the complexities of government spending. But as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want to shift our focus to something a bit more personal.
What do you have in mind?
I want to talk about what all of this means for you, the listener. How could a potential shift away from income tax impact your life, your finances, and your future? Stay with us. We're diving deeper right after this. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the world of ERS. We've explored the potential impact on government revenue spending and the broader economy. Now let's bring it all home and talk about what this could mean for you personally.
That's a crucial perspective after all these big economic ideas ultimately boil down to how they affect people's lives.
Exactly. So let's imagine for a moment that ERS becomes a reality. What are some of the practical implications you might experience in your day-to-day life?
Well, as we discussed earlier, one of the most immediate impacts would likely be higher prices on imported goods due to tariffs. This means you could see your grocery bill go up.
Right.
Your clothes might cost more,
Makes sense.
and those electronics you've been eyeing could become pricier.
So it's essential to factor that potential increase in your budget, especially if you rely heavily on imported goods.
Right. It's all about being aware of the potential shifts and adjusting your spending habits accordingly.
Now, on the flip side, we also talked about the possibility of tax cuts if ERS is implemented.
Right.
Trump has mentioned eliminating taxes on tips, overtime pay,
Yeah.
and even Social Security benefits.
And while the extent of those cuts remains uncertain, it's worth considering how they might impact your personal finances.
For example, if you earn a significant portion of your income from tips, those tax savings could be substantial.
Exactly. And even if you don't fall into those specific categories, any reduction in your overall tax burden could free up more money for savings investments or simply enjoying life.
That's the silver lining, right?
Yeah.
The potential for increased financial flexibility.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that tax cuts aren't always a straightforward win.
Right.
They can sometimes lead to cuts in government programs and services that you might rely on.
That's a crucial point. It's all interconnected. A change in one area of the budget can have ripple effects elsewhere.
Right. So while the prospect of lower taxes is appealing, it's essential to consider the potential trade-offs and weigh the overall impact on your personal situation.
So it sounds like the key takeaway here is to stay informed, be prepared for potential changes, and be proactive about managing your finances.
Exactly. And regardless of what happens with ERS, that's always good advice.
Couldn't agree more. But beyond the immediate financial implications, I think this whole ERS discussion raises some even bigger questions about our relationship with government and the role of taxes in society.
That's a fascinating point.
For example, if the government could potentially fund itself without directly taxing our income, does that change how we view our obligation to contribute?
It certainly challenges the traditional notion of taxation as a civic duty. And it raises questions about what we value as a society and how we choose to invest in our collective well-being.
It's like we're being asked to reimagine the social contract. If we're not directly paying for government services through income tax, are we still entitled to those services? And if so, how do we ensure they're funded adequately and fairly?
Those are profound questions, and there are no easy answers. But I think it's crucial that we engage in these conversations and grapple with these complex issues.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, the future of taxation isn't just about numbers and economic theories. It's about our values, our priorities, and the kind of society we want to create.
Well said. And that's something each of us has a role in shaping.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. If we were to truly reimagine the tax system, what would that look like? What principles would guide us? What goals would we strive to achieve?
It's a challenge, but also an opportunity, a chance to create a system that's fairer, more efficient, and better aligned with our shared values.
And that's a conversation worth having. So keep those brainwaves flowing, keep exploring those possibilities, and most importantly, stay engaged. The future of our economy and our society depends on it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those minds open to new ideas.